Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallam ala Sayyid al-awwaleen wal akhirin Nabiyyina Muhammadan wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds. Peace and blessings be constantly showered upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad, the master of the first and the last, and upon his family, his companions, and all those who call to his way, establish his sunnah to the day of judgment. As to what follows, my beloved brothers and sisters, to our friends, to our viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, in the beginning and in the end, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the opportunity to be Muslims in these challenging times, and the opportunity to reflect upon the good and the bad in our life, to try to clean our own existence up and to come closer to the creator of the heavens and the earth. And so this course that we are looking at, the groups and the sects in the Muslim world, is really developed not for high-level ideologues, not for people who are debating against each other ideologically, but it is developed for the mainstream Muslims. Also developed for people who are interested in Islam, who are studying Islam, who want to be familiar with names and terminologies. This is a confusing world that we are living in today, and it's important for us to go right to the source in order to understand any particular subject. So in this case, we are going right to the source, which is the basis of Islam, and that is the Book of Allah, the Quran, and then also the way of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Because this is the base of Islam. No matter what you call yourself, no matter what madhab you are, school of thought, no matter what movement, no matter what sect, the basis should be the nubuwah or tawheed, the oneness of Allah, the creator, and then nubuwah, the prophethood. That is the basis of everything that we are dealing with. And so using that as a framework, as the base, that this was the best generation, that in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, as he said, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. The best people are in my generation, and then those that follow them, and then the generation that follows them. And so, looking at it through their eyes, what they went through, not as angels from a part of paradise, but as human beings who are tested with the ability to do right and the ability to do wrong. They're tested with desires. They're challenged physically. They're challenged emotionally. That is the fate, or that is the condition of humanity. Islam comes as a way to elevate that condition, that the human being, who can at one point be higher than angels, and at another point, they can be the lowest of the low, that even animals would look at human beings and shake their head and be ashamed at what they are seeing, or be disgusted, the level that people can actually go to in terms of destroying each other and in destroying the environment around them. With this as a base, this is a primary source, and it is from that point of view that we try to break down terminologies that for some people may be very complicated. There may be gray areas, but we want to break it down, the base of it, to try to understand it as a phenomena, and then to see how the Muslim world broke into splinters and fractions. How human beings, with their feeling to be divided, or with their weakness in this sectarian way of looking at life, could take a beautiful, clear religion and then interpret it sometimes in the wrong way. And so that is the basis of what we are looking at. This was a very traumatic period of time. Right after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba themselves were in a state of shock. They were able to group themselves. They were able to hold on to the rope of Allah through the first two Khalifas, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu anh, and Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. They held solid. Uthman also, Ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, they held solid. Toward the end of his rule, divisions started to show based upon tribe and based upon power forces. And Uthman was a kind person. He was strong and resolute, but he was also the type of person that found it difficult to say no. He would prefer to keep people satisfied in an Islamic way. This was his disposition and his nature. And so during this time, we start to see divisions come in and poison coming into the Muslim world. Individuals, we know that the dynasties that were toppled over in the time of Umar, even the time of Uthman, the Persian dynasty, it's a long dynastic rule. The Romans, who lost their rule, they were not completely toppled, but they lost their authority in the Middle East. And so dynasties that had ruled for centuries, cultures that were very complicated, were not going to go away so easily. Opposition came from them. Opposition also came from the munafiqeen, from hypocrites within the ranks of the Muslims. And a munafiq is a person who appears to be a Muslim, but yet inside actually believes and does something else. There are also, of course, straight up disbelievers. There are those of the people of the book, who although they had the book, the Christians and the Jews, although they had the book, they were subject to a type of weakness based upon their ego or based upon their misinterpretation of the scriptures. And so opposition was coming in. And when Islam spread to Iraq, then we find another group coming in, that is the occult, the people of Siha, of magic. And this is a very dangerous group because the magicians and the people of occult, with their numerology and with their systems of confusion that are hard to see openly, they caused major divisions. And they were a type of runway or a type of opening for some of these other negative groups to try to come into the Muslim world and to seize power. But the companions held on the best they possibly could. And we find that with this confusion going on, a great fitna happened. And that is a trial, a tribulation, a gray area, which found, as the Prophet ﷺ had predicted, that there would be a great war would happen between two opposing parties of the believers. And they were both believers, but a war would happen. And so we found the Battle of the Camel. We also find the Battle of Siffin, where Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, who was selected as the Khalifa, found opposition from very close, from his own ranks, even from Aisha and Talha and Zubair, opposition that through the poison that was put into both sides caused a battle to happen. Of course, with the character that Sayyidina Ali had, he was able to calm down the situation and send Aisha back without harming her to deal with the Muslims in a positive way, although they had been involved in a great battle. But he was able to calm the situation down. But lo and behold, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, he was looming from Syria. He wanted the killers. He did not care about Khilafat. He wanted first to find the killers of Uthman, who was from his tribe, and whose wife had given him the responsibility to take revenge. And so the people of Syria, who had surrounded and supported Muawiyah, radiallahu anhu, he's a Sahabi Jalil, it caused the confusion. And this confusion led to a confrontation, unfortunate confrontation, in which over 70,000 people died in this great fitna, in this great war. This was a trauma. And so the ummah was traumatized at that point. Resulting from the trauma came the Khawarij. These are people who were very much involved in worship, but they lost something in their mind. Something snapped. And so they could be very pious and then justify the murder of companions, justify committing atrocities in the name of Islam. Ali confronted them and wiped them out except for a few. But of the ones that were left were those who wanted to take revenge. And so they sent assassins to kill Ali, Muawiyah, and Amr ibn al-As. The ones sent to Amr and Muawiyah were not successful, but Ali's assassin, Ibn Muljam, he was successful. And Ali radiallahu anh passed away. He did not make it a kingdom. He didn't say yes for Al-Hassan or no. And the companions and the Muslims chose Al-Hassan to be the Khalifa, but Al-Hassan had no intention to continue in any form of fitna, and he gave over the authority to Muawiyah. Valid Khilafat went into the hands of Muawiyah. And Muawiyah was able to calm things down. He was able to bring a type of order back to the Muslim world. The fighting was over. The fitna, that confusion, was over. And money was being put toward madrasas. Money was being put towards calling to the good and forbidding evil. The armies went out to defend the borders of Islam. And so the energy of the Muslims could then be taken away from each other and then given to what it's supposed to be, and that is calling to the good and forbidding evil. And so the word Shia was used for the first time, a sect or a group. It was used to describe Shia to Ali and Shia to Muawiyah. So that is the group supporting Ali and the group supporting Muawiyah. That's the first time the terminology is being used. It is nowhere being in the Quran and Sunnah as a group, as an identity. No, we're supposed to avoid falling into different groups and different categories like this. So, Shia to Ali continued. These were the supporters of Amir al-Mu'mineen. But Shia to Muawiyah, once he took over the authority, became the government, and so was no longer used. Banu Umayyah was being used. The Umayyad dynasty was the terminology used to describe Muawiyah, especially his descendants, because Muawiyah was still coming in as a companion. And so the Shia terminology has a political tone to it, because the people who identified as Shia, they didn't say I'm a Shia. Everybody is identifying as a Muslim, as Allah described us. Muslimin, Mu'mineen, Muhsineen. That's how Allah described us. They did not say I'm a Shia and you're a Sunni. This is important to try to understand, because we're trying to unpack these different names and these understandings. And so Shia to Ali were the supporters. This is what I'm terming as political Shi'ism. Now you're going to see the word tashayya in Arabic. Tashayya it's spelled in different ways. In English they say Shiites or Shiaism. I say Shi'ism. So there's different ways of looking at it. It's all the same. Okay, so it's the ideology of the Shia. And so the political version of Shi'ism, those are the supporters who opposed the oppressive Umayyad dynasty. And again, in the time of Muawiyah, many of the companions, including people who were Shia to Ali, joined in the great jihads, especially the jihad to Constantinople. And so there was no major groups fighting each other at this time. It wasn't until later on when Muawiyah made a fatal mistake, and that was he began to think about making his son Yazid as the crown prince. This is a mistake. This is where Khilafat turns into kingdom. And so opposition now starts to rise, especially when Muawiyah then passes away and Yazid takes over. And Yazid, although he led the army representing Banu Umayyah to Constantinople, he was an official. He was the son of Muawiyah, but he was not a person who qualified to the highest level to be the one who takes over, because this is a meritocracy. And there was still Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, Abdullah ibn Zubair, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Abbas. There were still great companions left over. And these are like the sons of even the leaders, the Khalifas, were still there. Some of the sons of Abu Bakr were still there. So, I mean, if you're looking for somebody in a dynastic way, or somebody who has high qualifications, then people like Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Zubair, this is the highest standard that you can get in terms of piety and leadership ability. And so opposition began to rise. And when the opposition arose against Yazid, we find that it was led by Abdullah ibn Zubair. And remember, during the fitna, Al-Hussein and Zubair, Abdullah ibn Zubair, went to Mecca. So from Mecca, Abdullah ibn Zubair radiallahu anhuma starts to organize. Al-Hussein, as we found out, got the word from Kufa, from the people of Iraq, that they would support him. He was vehemently encouraged not to go, but he was a person who would stand for the truth, highly opinionated, and he went towards Iraq to unfortunately find his demise at the terrible tragedy of Karbala, where the armies were sent from the Umayyads and where he and many of his family members were put to death. The opposition continued. There were people who still supported Hussein. There were those Kufans, over almost 12,000, who said they were going to support him, but when the armies were sent, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and the armies of the Umayyads came into Kufa and Iraq, they got afraid and they left al-Hussein alone. These are the people at Tawabun. These are the people who wanted to make repentance, because they realized that they were guilty of leaving al-Hussein radiallahu anh. Is a terrible feeling. And so they went to Karbala, where the slaughter happened, to the area where they were buried. They wanted to make Tawbah. They started instituting different practices, whether it be self-flagellation, crying, and doing many different things, giving sadaqah, whatever they could do to make Tawbah for this terrible tragedy. And so, but that group at the time were still Muslims. It was not a Shia group that is different than Sunni groups. Remember, this is important to understand. It was still all following the Quran and following the way of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And following this, the opposition in Mecca was put down. And succeeding leaders within Banu Umayyah, to the point of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, armies were sent, and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, the Umayyad general, took over Mecca and killed Abdullah ibn Zubair radiallahu anhu. And so the political opposition was put down to a great extent. But in terms of the Shia to Ali, so the Zubair faction put down. But Shia to Ali is in Iraq, especially in Kufa. And that is important for us to understand, because Kufa, as we found out before, was one of the centers of the occult. And we recognize, and the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah, that Harut and Marut, that angels came into Babylon, into Babel, and they brought magic. And so this was the seat of magic, and most of the occult groups in the world, when they go back to their root, they will go back to ancient Iraq. Sometimes they go to Egypt and other places, but the real serious groups. The extreme groups will go back to the basis of magic coming into the world. And so the extreme elements coming out of Kufa, traumatized as well, traumatized by the killing of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali radiallahu anh, the killing of al-Hussein, the Khawarij and the insanity things that they were doing. It's a terrible trauma. And so it is a point where people are very weak. And it is a point where what we could call theological Shi'ism. So remember the difference. Political Shi'ism, this is the Ahlul Bayt people, the ones supporting Ali and those around him. And now theological Shi'ism. So this is where the group starts to take on an identity. It starts to take on religious symbols and incorporate them into their understanding of Islam. Now, how is this possible? If we look at the case of Christianity, we recognize that Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, the son of Mary, may Allah be pleased with them both, he was a mighty messenger of Allah. And he was sent to Bani Israel. He was sent to establish the law of Moses, to bring out the spirituality, not the letter of the law, but to also reinforce the spirit of the law. And so his followers, his disciples, strict monotheists, strictly following the law of Moses. All of his followers were Jewish. And this is important to understand. This is who he came to. And that is what his teachings basically were about. But later on, after his demise, we believe he was raised, but after his leaving of the earth, one of the tormentors of the disciples named Saul claimed that he had a vision on the Damascus road. He saw Jesus coming down, and he named himself Paul. And he felt that he was given inspiration. And so when Paul went to the disciples with Barnabas, who was one of his classmates and friends, they rejected him. Why? Not just because he was a tormentor, but because he was bringing in new ideas. He was trying to bring in the concepts that they could use other than the law of Moses. It's what we would call today bid'ah. He brought in innovations. And once you open the door to religious innovations, where you're changing the religion, you're allowing other religions to affect your religious understanding. I'm not talking about your material progress, but your religious understanding. Now you are changing the basis of the religion itself. And so it was that base, the door being opened, when the Christians went into Greece and into Rome, and they mixed with the people who worshiped many gods, the gods of the Greeks, Zeus, Aphrodite, the gods of the Romans with Jupiter and Cupid and Venus, all of these myriad amount of so-called gods that they believed in. Also the belief in sun gods, the belief in Mithras, the Son of God who came down to the earth, died for the sins of people. The Trinity concept, this is not a concept that was in the teachings of Isa alayhi salam, but it was there in the ancient world. And so with this hodgepodge in the Mediterranean, and then we find in the 4th century Constantine, the Roman emperor of the Eastern Orthodox Christian empire, who took over Rome. Constantine brought it together and incorporated sun worship with the original teachings of Isa alayhi salam. Now, to try to understand when exactly that happened is impossible. To try to understand where it happened, this blending, it's almost impossible. We can see it with Constantine. We can see it with the message going north, and we know that the pagan nature worship is very powerful all over Europe. This is thousands of years of belief. So this is not going away. The sun worship, ancient belief, this is not going away. And so somebody must have said, if you can't beat them, join them. When in Rome, do like the Romans do. And it is thought that Christians being sacrificed to the lions, being murdered, somebody at some point couldn't take it. And so they developed a type of compromise faith, and they incorporated the nature worshiping celebrations and concepts into the belief. Until now, when the spring season comes, they say it's Easter time. And the Christians look at it as the time of resurrection from the dead, life after death. But Easter is a pagan goddess of the nature people, Austray, Eastern, or Easter, we say in English. And they believe she would wave her wand, and after the winter, everything would turn green. Life after death. You see it? So the nature religion, the monotheistic religion, or what is left of it, because the bid'ah form, right? They're mixed together to the point where a Christian can now say, I am a Christian and you are a Jew. We're different, but they're not supposed to be different. The basis is the same. And so how it happened, when it happened, very difficult to actually understand, but we can see the process going on. So similarly, in looking at Islam being spread, especially into Iraq, into this Tigris and Euphrates region, we find that there are a number of power groups who want to come back. They could not defeat the Muslims militarily. They could not defeat the Muslims spiritually. Muslims were even incorporating other people. They couldn't stop it. And they were corrupt and decaying themselves. And so what is left of the Sassanid dynasty fled into the highlands, Turkestan and the areas high in the mountains, but they wanted to come back. And so they penetrated, trying to push the importance of their dynasty. Because remember, they believed that the sun god, they are Majus, Zoroastrians, fire worshippers, and they believed that the sun manifests through their leaders, and the fire is sacred. We're still lighting the Olympic torch up until today. So this is not going away. As you can see, it's still on the scene. Your Jedi Knights, your field of force, the good part or the bad part, yin, yang, this concept. This is the ancient beliefs. So it's not going away. It changes form. And that's where the monotheism has to be revived, constantly revived, to throw off the different innovations that will culturally come along with the weakness of people. Also, the supporters of Ibn Saba, who still were there, especially in Kufa. That was one of their bases after the assassination of Uthman, radiallahu anh. Many of them ran back to Kufa. So they're still around. Then there are just opposition people who just don't like Syrians, who don't want Arabs to rule them. And so there's a number of groups, and the opposition starts. And it starts to take a form that we could call theological Shi'ism. And extreme elements start to surface in the area of Kufa. So many different names. Again, if you read Ibn Jawzi's work, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, and a number of writers, you will see Al-Tabari, a number of writers, you will see some of these groups. It's so much, it can get confusing. But to show you the level of confusion that they went to, they took these wrong ideas of Abdullah ibn Saba, and that is the deification of Ali radiallahu anhu, and something which had nothing to do with Islam, even with Ali himself. And when he found people who were trying to make him into a god, he punished them very harshly. He even burnt some of them alive, something which is unprecedented. But they were so crazy with their belief, they would retort, now we know you're God, because only God can punish with fire. And so this extremism starts to show itself. Ishaq ibn Muhammad al-Ahmar, this is one example. He claimed that Ali was Allah, and that he would appear at different times. And sometimes he would appear as Al-Hassan, Sometimes he would appear as Al-Hussein. And so concepts like this. And the group now is deifying Ali and looking at um, his, uh, his family as a type of divine base and focusing on this and opposing the Umayyad dynasty at the same time. Now, the confusion came for the common people, and this is our confusion up until today, is that when the Shia would get into arguments with other people or debates, they would immediately go back to political Shiism. And that is the position of Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, who were persecuted and needed to be defended. And that is something that all of the Muslims believe. And so that is a noble movement. That is not changing the religion. And so the people who were bringing in this deification and these other confusing ideas would jump to the political thing, put it in the front. And you'll see it up until today. When somebody is questioned from the extreme Shia side, then immediately Ahlul Bayt. Immediately the political Shiism then shows itself. But the reality is something else on the ground. A good example of this, probably I would say the best clear example of how the group split now, where this split came in Shiism itself. It comes through Imam Zayd ibn Ali ibn al-Hussein. So this is the famous Imam Zayd. Now remember, he's Zayd ibn Ali ibn al-Hussein. So it's Hussein's grandson. Great Muslim, knowledgeable, pious, opposed to the Umayyads. He starts to lead a rebellion in the 8th century against the Umayyad dynasty. And he calls for support from the people, especially in Kufa, because this is the area of his great-grandfather. This is Ali's capital. This is the base. This is the Shia to Ali. So he calls for support from them. At the same time, this turmoil, this hodgepodge of ideas starts to come, and this pure imam is coming, and he is appealing to the people, and a group of the Shia then come forward, and they say, we'll support you, but you should curse the companions. Especially you should curse Abu Bakr and Umar, because they shouldn't have been the Khalifa. So you can curse them, curse Uthman, curse all of those who supported this. This is foreign in terms of belief. Because remember, there is no Sunni and Shia at the time. Although this is a person of Ahlul Bayt on the highest level, he's a Muslim. He's praying like everybody else. He's fasting like everybody else. He does not call himself a Shia. And when he hears this, he responds to them in words that Abu Bakr, Umar, may Allah be pleased with them, they were the best of us. They followed the Prophet ﷺ, and my grandfather supported them, and I will support them. I will never curse them. And because of that, they left him alone. And they turned against him. And he said, Rafadtumuni, you denied me. So this now is one of the imams, you're going to use that terminology, right? Because he's under Hussein, right? It's one of the imams. And he's saying to this group, Rafadtumuni, you are deniers, ar-Rafidah. So the terminology that many people use for the extreme now is ar-Rafidah. So this is the extreme theological Shiism. So Imam Zayd then continues to struggle. That's political Shiism. Okay, he's struggling against the Umayyads with Shia to Ali. And unfortunately, he is eventually defeated. The people, left him in these groups, these strange groups in Kufa, and he was martyred. And the other group then continues. And so you can say then, in a sense, that the Rafida becomes the extreme theological Shiism, and the followers of Imam Zayd, may Allah be pleased with him, they become um, the Twelvers. The Rafida becomes the Imamate or the Twelvers, and the other group becomes the Zaydiyah. Okay, so here you have the two sides, because we want to go slowly through this to make it clear. You have the political Shiism, and that is Imam Zayd, who struggles against the Umayyads. He's regular Sunnah, regular Salat, but then you have the theological side, which is the Rafida. So this Rafida group is the extreme group. This is where the Imamate starts to come in. And this is where the Itna Ashari, the Twelvers, the 12 Imams, these groups start to come in on the two sides. So you have the theological and you have the political Shiism. So to try to understand this, I want to look at the chart. I hope you can see this chart here that I'm putting up. And you see on the top is Ali and Fatima. So remember, the Prophet ﷺ did not have any male children who succeeded him. And so by the will of Allah, there was no crown prince. And the people who needed to have that son, they needed that blood dynasty through a male, they couldn't get it. The closest to that was Ali radiallahu anhu, was his cousin, and who grew up in his house, because his father Abu Talib was poor at the time, although he was Sharif, noble. So Ali was, in a sense, like his son, and he was Ali radiallahu anhu, great companion, first male to accept Islam, great Sahabi Jalil, and he marries Fatima. So in terms of bloodline, that is the closest to a direct bloodline from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Ali had sons. He had Al-Hussein, Al-Hassan, Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. These are the most prominent of the sons of Ali radiallahu anhu. Now, what is not known by a lot of people is that Al-Hussein, on his side of the family, when the Muslims captured Iraq and brought down Persia, the great battle of Al-Qadisiyah, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, radiallahu anhu, they brought down the Sassanids. There were a number of prisoners of war. Amongst the prisoners of war, there were members of the royal family. And so it was the practice to incorporate them into society, bonded servitude. I'm not going to use slave term or anything like this. It has nothing to do with this. Or right-hand possession is a terminology coming out of the Quran. And so Hussein was given one of the female members of the ruling dynasty of the Sassanids, Persian dynasty, as a right-hand possession, Sherbanu. And he freed her and he married her. And so the children coming from Al-Hussein and Sherbanu have not only the prophetic blood, or the closest to it, but they also have the blood of the Persian dynasty that the people in that region considered to be holy. They considered it to be connected to the sun god, and that it deserved leadership above anybody else. So that combination starts to make a group of leaders. And this is important for us to be able to unpack what is going on. Now, we'll look at this chart here. Some of the terminologies we'll be going back to again in more details as we go along. But basically, the survivor of Al-Hussein coming out of Karbala is Ali Zain al-Abidin. So in a sense, he would be considered to be the next Imam. Ali is the first, Al-Hassan is the second, Al-Hussein is the third, and Ali Zain al-Abidin is the fourth. So these numbers were not being used at the time, by the way. There's no dynasty of Imams. But this would be the leading figures within the Ahlul Bayt, the people who had to protect the family, the people who stood up for that important bloodline, which is something that is important to all Muslims. Under Ali, Zain al-Abidin is Muhammad al-Baqir. And his brother is Imam Zayd. Now again, from Imam Zayd is then coming the Zaydiyah, right? So that is the Zaydi group of Shia. But the mainstream Shia is coming from Muhammad al-Baqir. And when we go down, we find Jafar as-Sadiq coming as number 6, Imam Jafar. And Imam Jafar, rahimahullah, is described as extremely pious person. And he was a colleague of Imam Malik ibn Anas, rahimahullah, the great Imam Dar al-Hijrah, Maliki school of thought. They knew each other in Medina, and they were all practicing Sunnah. So it wasn't like the Shia Imam over here, the Shia mosque, and the Sunni mosque where the Malikis are. No, they were all Muslims under the Quran and under the way of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so under Imam Jafar, who's number 6, they had to choose number 7. And 7, as we'll find out later, is a mystical number from the ancient societies. So the 7th Imam was going to be a very important Imam, especially the occult. Now remember the people who are coming in from Kufa. They have numerological systems where they use numbers in order to weigh Arabic. And so the numbers, they tied them together. And these numbers are being used up until today. I mean, we use it. For instance, people say instead of writing Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, they put 786. Right? You might have 786 on your ring or on your door. Where did 786 come from? It did not come from the Sunnah. It did not come from anything to do with the companions. But it's later the people who weighed things in Iraq in terms of number systems that they were developing. It's a highly advanced system, but it's not the revelation. Okay, so 7 is important. The Imam coming in, the eldest would have been Ismail. He had problems, and we'll be discussing that more as we go along. And so Jafar chose Musa al-Kadhim. After Musa al-Kadhim comes Ali al-Rida. After Ali Rida comes Muhammad al-Taqi. After Muhammad al-Taqi comes Ali al-Hadi. Ali al-Hadi. After him came Hassan al-Askari. And after him came Muhammad al-Muntadhar. And that is the final 12th Imam of the 12ers who believe that the Imamate stopped at 12. And this is the final one that they call Imam al-Mahdi. And we will be going back to some of this to give more details. But just to give you a general understanding, of how these names are starting to now take shape. Now, remember, if we go back up a little bit, and you see Muhammad al-Baqir, again, it's Ahlul Bayt, great leader of the family, but another great Imam is Imam Zayd. And Imam Zayd does not take the theological Shi'ism. He breaks away, and his followers develop themselves. This is called Zaydiyah. This is Zaydiyah. And we find the Zaydi sect, or the Zaydi group, especially in Yemen and the Caspian region. Now, this is going up toward Russia. So up in that area there, Turkestan and these areas, some of the Zaydis are up in there. But the most powerful group of the Zaydiyah established itself in Yemen. And when you look at the Zaydiyah, their fiqh, their jurisprudence is very similar to the Sunnah. But they do retain the political belief that Imam Ali should have been chosen. They felt that Ali was the most deserving for the Khilafat. But they show respect for all of the Imams. So they respect Abu Bakr, they respect Umar and Uthman. Okay, so there's no problem there. They do retain some aspects of the Shi'ism practice from theological now. Some of it spilled over into them, like the adhan. They've added on a section, to the adhan, which we'll go into with more details. Amongst the practices of the theological Shia is a practice called muta, and that is temporary marriage. So the Zaydiyya, like the people of the Sunnah, reject temporary marriage, where you can get married, you make an agreement, and so 3 days later, after your weekend is over, you go to Niagara Falls and have your 3 days, and then Monday comes, we're divorced. It was a temporary marriage, muta. So you will enjoy yourself for the weekend, and then we're not married anymore. That is rejected by Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Zaydiyya also rejects it. And it's interesting because the Zaydiyya is the prominent school of thought, so to speak, in Yemen. And that's relevant because the Houthis today, where the struggle is going on in Yemen, they're Zaydis. So this is the Zaydiyya. And so this is complicated. And this is what we can understand more what's going on the ground when you understand these differences. If you study the Ottomans and Turkish culture, especially coming from Mawara and Naha, beyond the Oxus River in Turkestan and these areas, Caspian region, you'll see heavy emphasis on Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh. It seems like they're Shia, so how are they Shia type people that are up there in the mountains? I thought they were just the Sunnah of the Ottoman. No, Zaydiyyas are up there. So this is important to try to understand. Now, the mainstream body of Tashayya, this is Shi'ism. And again, how it happened, when it happened, it's extremely difficult to pin down the actual time. But we see a transition happening, and we know the opposition that is there. And one of the key issues that separated the Ahl Sunnah from the Shia is the concept of imamat. And that is the sanctity of the imams. That those 12 imams that you see are actually a specially designated group of people that is supposed to take the leadership. And secondly, it's dealing with the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and whether you accept them or you don't accept them. The third is their perspective on the Quran itself. What is their understanding of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The fourth is muta, and that is instituted by their imams, coming in the temporary marriage. And the fifth is the concept of taqiyya, and that is pious deception, dissimulation. And that is that you can deceive somebody. We see in the story of the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, when he came into Egypt and he was approached by the tyrannical leaders at the time, the Hyksos, who were in the pharaonic position at the time. And they wanted to rape his wife, and they said, "Who is this?" And he said, "It's my sister." And if it was his sister, that wouldn't be so good. They like to take control of your wife. So sister is different, a blood feud can come and whatever. So they let her alone. What did he mean? My sister in faith, not my blood sister. Okay, that's taqiyya. So now, what shape does it take? It takes the shape where the Shiite groups are now under pressure. They're under pressure by the Umayyads. They are even under pressure by political Shiism, like the Zaydiyya. They don't accept them. And so they are being hunted down in certain parts of Iraq and Syria and other places. So therefore, they can lie to you. And within their own theological belief, they're getting blessings from telling lies to a Sunni. So these are some of the key distinguishing points, and we want to go into these points. Before we go into it, I want to break just for a moment to remind you that if you have questions, you can put it forward in the chat, send it to the Facebook, get your information to us, and at the end, we'll have a discussion with some of the questions that you may have, because it may appear to be a little bit confusing. Again, I'll be going over the names, so you start to see how this develops. I'm concentrating a very broad-based topic. There's hundreds of groups. There's all types of schisms, but I'm bringing it together so that the common mainstream Muslims can begin to understand what the basis of this Shi'ism is. Okay, so the basis of it, and I want to see, before we go on, are there any questions so far that has come up? Okay, so we want to, at this point, stop and answer some of the questions before we go on to some of the details concerning the mainstream Itna Ashariya, the Twelvers, their mainstream beliefs. So floor is up to question.
Okay, so the first question is, who should be considered as the founder of theological Shi'ism?
Yeah, so the question is, who should be considered the founder of theological Shi'ism? That's impossible to identify an individual. Because again, it's a hodgepodge of people living in Kufa. And again, like the case of Imam Zayd, that's your leaders. So they're supposed to be the leaders of the Shia movement. But when you look at Imam Zayd, when you look at Jafar as-Sadiq, Ali Zain al-Abidin, Muhammad al-Baqir, all the Imams, you will see that in their personal practice, they were regular Muslims. Imam Malik respected Imam Jafar. They lived together. They prayed together. There was no Sunni masjid and Shia masjid. So it is really an underground type of thing that starts to develop. And there's no particular person that we can take it back to say this is the theological Shi'ism. If you went to a theological Shia himself or herself, they would say the base is from Ali. The base is the Quran. But it's their misinterpretation of the Quran. Because when you actually go back to Ali's time, al-Hassan and Hussein, nobody's talking, I'm a Shia and you're a Sunni. The term is not even being used. You see? So it's something that comes later, and it masks and disguises a Persian dominance that wants to come back. Also an opposition from the occult, from the people of magic who want to come back. So it's impossible to really pin it down to anybody in particular. Question?
The next question is, are there main imams from the Hassan side, as you didn't mention much on the diagram?
Yes. From the side of al-Hassan, this is the Zaydiya. If I go back here a little bit to the chart that we have, and then you see where it says al-Hassan and al-Hussein. Now, al-Hassan, from his side, al-Hassan got married a lot. And they say he had around 21 sons. So there are a lot of Hassani imams or descendants. And the most prominent of the Hassan descendants actually migrated to North Africa, to the city of Fez, and formed a group called Idrisids. So this is the family of Idris, who is a descendant of Al-Hassan. And they're Ahlul Bayt. And up until now, the king of Morocco, King Mohammed, considers himself to be Ahlul Bayt. And you know the Sharifs and the Sayyids that are there in Morocco. So that's a Hassani type of background. You'll also find some of the Hassanis also in Turkestan and the regions there. They're in different places, but they're not as prominent politically. They didn't take a political type of shape at all, but they are known as the Sharifs. You'll see some of the Sharifs are in Hadramaut. Some of them went to Pakistan, Afghanistan. Some of them went into Somalia, in Ethiopia. There are actually sharifs in the city of Harar. That is in Ethiopia, today what is now Ethiopia. But the Hassani side did not take a very prominent role politically, but except in the case of Morocco. And that is where the Hassani family is. Now, question.
Where do we find the Zaydiyya nowadays?
The Zaydiyya, that the main place of the Zaydiyya is Yemen. What is remaining of the Zaydiyya in the Caspian region, that would be in the Turkestan region there. There are still some remnants of it, but it did not take a form. The main shape is Yemen. They are the majority of Yemenis. They're actually Zaydiyya. But they're so close to the Sunnah that it's very difficult to really even tell the difference between a person who is a Zaydi and a person who is a Sunni until certain discussion, may happen. So Yemen is the base of the Zaydi group.
Clyde Wallace Jr. asks, where do the 12 imams come from? I mean, where does it come from that there will be these 12 imams that are in the discussion?
Yeah, so the 12 imams that we are talking about, this is really, they didn't call themselves the 12 imams. So in other words, from the time of Ali, he was Amir al-Mu'mineen. So he didn't say, I'm the first of the imams, and there will be a group of imams after me. Because if he did that, it would be a kingdom. In other words, he would be saying, my family will be the leaders. My children's 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 children, they're the only ones that can lead you. That would be like Muawiyah. But this is Khilafat. That's the difference between the Khilafat and the kingdom. So he didn't say that. Al-Hassan, who took over as Amir al-Mu'mineen, he did not say, I'm number 2. He didn't say Al-Hussein, who was opposing Yazid. He did not say, I'm number 3. He was very close to Abdullah ibn Zubair and the other companions. He didn't say, I'm number 3, I'm a Shia and the rest of them are Sunnis. No. Even Ali Zain al-Abidin, he didn't say, I'm number 4. He was just trying to survive, after this disaster that happened to the family. And then Muhammad al-Baqir, and then you go right down, they were not calling themselves necessarily the 12. And it's not till later, really, that this ideology starts to take shape. And again, it's a long period of time. Much of it is underground. It gets mixed in with another group that we'll be studying called the Batiniya. The real magicians start to come into it. So it's fairly confusing, but it's not until much later in literature, hundreds of years later from these original times, that you see specifically saying the 12 and listing the 12. You're not going to find that in the early literature because they didn't call themselves that. Question. So this is the basis that we have. Again, it's important to understand what happened and to recognize that probably the key point, and I want to emphasize this point again in our conclusion, and that is the leadership. But this is really where you can say there is a split. And again, it's more really political Shi'ism for those sincere people following the Ahlul Bayt. And that is that the concept of Khalifa. The Khalifa is the successor of the Prophet ﷺ. It's the deputy representing Allah Almighty on earth, the vicegerent. And it is not reserved to a special family. There are traditions pointing us to the fact that if we could find somebody from Quraysh who has the qualifications, then we would prefer that, because that reminds us of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the Qurayshi dialect. And so we would prefer that. But if not, it's not reserved to a special family. 3, that the person should not be aspiring to be a Khalifa. In other words, you don't start off and say, I am the Khalifa, it's my political party, and you start getting votes to be the Khalifa. No, you are designated by this. You're chosen by the Muslims for this position. And so it is through shura that the ummah then chooses its leadership, who should be the most suitable. Point number 4 is that the Khalifa should use shura where others have the right to disagree. So in other words, the Khalifa depends on the shura. He's not a dictator. And the shura can sometimes even overrule him. He should accept this, when he sees overwhelming evidence. Next is that when the Khalifa dies or becomes incapacitated, his office does not pass on to his son. See, this is a key point. The office does not pass on to his son. Okay, so that's the concept of Khalifa that we have. And the Caliph is a mortal person. There's no supernatural powers that the Khalifa has. The Khalifa is a mortal human being. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has established in Surah Hujurat, verse 13, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that the most honored in the sight of Allah is the most righteous. That's the one. In Surah Nur, Allah tells us Allah has promised to those amongst you who believe and work righteous deeds, alladhina amanu wa amila salihat, that He will surely grant them power in the earth, istikhlaf, as He granted those before them. So this verse is showing istikhlaf, but it's those who believe and do righteous deeds, not a special family, not a designated group of individuals. That would be a kingdom. That would be a Persian dynasty. That would be an Egyptian pharaoh. That would be a Roman dynasty. But it's not. Then Allah tells us, O you who believe, obey Allah, His messenger, wa ulul amri minkum, and those among you trusted with authority. And the Prophet ﷺ said very clearly in traditions that you hear and obey your leader, whoever it is. Hear and obey. He did not directly point out and say, when I die, there's a special group of people who must be the leaders. There's no other way. This is the way of Islam. He did not say this. This is the Islamic concept of Khilafah. And it's important because even in our own times today, we have people who jumped up and say they're the Khalifa. Who decided you're the Khalifa? What shura did you take? What are the qualifications that you had to actually do this? It's not istikhlaf. And we saw the confusion in the Middle East behind this. And we will see even later that this word, the terminology, has been used by other people, wrongly used by people. But going back to the source is very clear. The concept of the prophetic rule, that rule based upon the way of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so the basis of Islam is clear. It's important to keep reminding ourselves that the concept of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of the Sunnah and the major group, the body of the Muslims, that comes directly from Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. It comes directly from the Khulafa al-Rashidin. This is the basis of it. And those righteous leaders throughout Islamic history have followed this way. The schisms and isms and break-offs and confusions that have come along are the egos of people. It is the hidden agenda. It is talbis iblis. It is the deception of the devil, wal-iyadu billah, that has come in. The haters that have come in, the munafiqeen that have come in. That's the confusion that crept back into the Muslim world at different points in time. Much different than the concept that was delivered to us. And the only reason why, one of the only reasons why Allah blessed us not to be gone into a mass of confusion is that we do have the Quran, we do have the Sunnah. Allah blessed us with this, and Allah blessed us with tajdeed, with revival, Islamic revival. That there would be people who would come along, and the Prophet ﷺ said at the head of every century, ra'si kulli qarnin mujaddid, at the head of every century, 100 years or generation, would be mujaddid, a reviver of the faith. What would the reviver of the faith be? Not to change it into a different religion or a different way. The reviver of the faith would bring back those principles set by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that can be used by people of all nations at any point in time in our history. So as we come to our conclusion here at this point, we're going slowly into this because it will start to unfold. But to understand, the basis right from the beginning, that throughout the time of these 12 imams that are there, those early periods, there's no separate group called Shia. There's no separate religion. There are people who support the Ahlul Bayt, but they do not brand themselves and pray differently and think that they're different than the majority, the Jama'ah. They are part of the Jama'ah. And it's only later that the schisms start to take form. And eventually, as we will see way down 15th century, it'll take a state form. But before this, it's no state. It's only a few individuals. And when the occult people come in, the Batiniya come in, and that's another level, then we'll see the Batiniya who form their own state. And we'll see other levels of confusion that start to come in base. But this is the base, that there are leaders of the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ. There are leaders there. Okay? And they protect the family. And it's very important to understand the usage of Ahlul Bayt, because people want to say it's a specific bloodline. And it is reported that in the Battle of the Khandaq, in the trench, just before the battle, when the companions were digging a trench to protect the northern side of Medina from the Ahzab, the thousands that were coming to destroy them, the Muhajirin and the Ansar, the Muslims, were digging this trench with their hands, with picks, with axes. It was difficult. It was cold. The ground is hard. And it is reported that Salman al-Farisi, radiallahu anh, came along. He was a strong man. He was a Persian man, and he had gone through, a migration, an amazing life, and physically he was extremely powerful. And so when the Muhajirin saw him, they said, Salman minna. Salman, you're one of us. You made migration, right? So you're one of us. And then the Ansar said, no, Salman minna. He's one of us because he was from the people of Medina, because he took his Shahada, accepted Islam in Medina. And the Prophet ﷺ came along in authentic tradition and said, Salman minna Ahlul Bayt. He is from us. He is the family. He is my family, Ahlul Bayt. So he used this term Ahlul Bayt for a Persian man who grew up, who was originally a fire worshipper, whose father was a priest of the fire worship, who after years embraced Islam, who was not Arab, who learned to speak Arabic, did not have Qurayshi blood, but yet he would use the term Ahlul Bayt. And you'll see Ahlul Bayt being used in many different ways. And it's important for us to understand what was their understanding of it, and then what is the understanding hundreds of years later, when people have agendas, and their agenda of power, of tribalism, of ego, clouds their understanding of the deen. So as we come to a conclusion, we want to once again look, are there any questions that anybody has concerning what we've covered tonight? Floor is open for any questions.
No questions, but the ones that you have answered,
so alhamdulillah, I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would show us the truth. Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqa warzuqna ittiba'a wa arina al-batila batilan warzuqna ijtinaba. O Allah, give us and show us the truth for being the truth, and bless us with following it. And distinguish the falsehood. Show us what falsehood really is, and bless us with staying away from falsehood. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless this Muslim world with a pure return, a pure tajdeed, a revival going back to the sources, to that beautiful drink of the fresh water of the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions and those first generations. May Allah bless us to be able to go back. And those who are accepting Islam, may Allah bless them not to be confused with the isms and schisms, but to drink from the fresh water of Islam and to get the blessings of Allah in this life and the hereafter. I leave you with these thoughts, and I ask Allah to have mercy on me and you. Wa akhira da'wana an alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.